Jehu and really the downfall of the house of Ahab. Okay, that's what we've really been looking at. You remember Ahab from a great portion of the end of First Kings is dedicated to his reign because he led the northern tribes into Baal worship, which was a step further than Jeroboam had led them. And so we've seen Jehu, who is anointed, and he ends up killing the king of the north and the king of the south. And then he kills Jezebel. He kills all of the descendants of Ahab, anyone who had a rightful claim to the throne. And then he kills, we saw at the end of a couple weeks ago, he kills all of the worshipers of Baal and tears that house down. So Baal worship, Ahab's family in the north is gone. Baal worship in the north is gone. And we're actually in chapter 11, we talked about there's some overlap here. Ahab's family in the south in chapter 11, and also Baal worship in the south in chapter 11 will be eradicated. And then that will cease to be for some time. So where we are, let's just pick up in 28, where it's just kind of a summary of his reign. I think we left off about verse 32, but we'll pick up there in 28. It says, "Thus Jehu wiped out Baal worship from Israel, but Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel to sin, that is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and you have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart. Your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all of his heart. He did not turn from his sins, or from the sins of Jeroboam, with which he made Israel to sin." Now, Jeroboam, of course, is this king from 1 Kings 12 that we talked about when God split the kingdom over Solomon, Solomon's transgressions. God came to Jeroboam and said, "Look, I'm going to give you the 10 northern tribes. If you'll be faithful, I'll establish you the same way I established David's house." He chose to go a different direction, and that would always be a thorn in their side. And we see him, we talked about him when we got there, that it's a continual refrain. Whenever you see Jeroboam mentioned again, it's always with the sin with which he made Israel to sin. Like that is the tag that is attached to his name throughout the rest of the book. And every king is judged against either Jeroboam's sin or David's righteousness. Okay? In the north, they're judged against Jeroboam's sin because they all end up going the same way Jeroboam did. In the south, they're judged against David. Either they were faithful as David had been, or they were not faithful as David had been, or their heart was not wholly faithful as David had been. And so he becomes kind of this standard of understanding. Now, God is pleased with the fact that he executes the house of Ahab. He follows instructions. Okay, we've seen plenty of kings who can't follow instructions when God lays them out very clearly. Ahab being one of those. And so for that reason, he allows him to continue, and his family will reign on the throne in Israel for, it says here, the fourth generation, which is roughly 100 years. And that is longer than any family will reign in the north. Remember, in the south, there is no break in the succession. Everybody who reigns in the south is a descendant of David. The people who reign in the north, they're different families. Those families change up from time to time. And so Jehu's family will be the one that lasts the longest. And so God credits him for doing what he's supposed to do with Ahab, but he also has something against him because he refuses to give up the sin of Jeroboam. He refuses to follow God wholly with his heart. And it ends up being one of his downfalls. And so here you see a guy who has some good traits, but also he has some bad ones. He just doesn't make that full transition the way that he needs to. And when I study the kings, especially when you get to the end of all of these kings, you see that summation, that statement of their reign, where it says they either followed Jeroboam or they followed David or they didn't follow David. Like that's the tag that's put on their life. And for me, when I look at this and I'm studying this, especially on a practical level, you know, when our lives are done, somebody's going to put a tag on them. Like there'll be a tag attached to our name. When it's brought up, there'll be something that's attached to our name forever. People will remember us for something. Now we get the choice of deciding how we want that tag to read. But obviously the person who refuses to follow God, that's a tag that's disappointing. That's not one that we want. But I think even more disappointing than the person who chooses not to follow God, even though that's a disappointment, the person I think that probably disappoints me the most is the person who halfway follows God. We're going to run into we've run into some kings, and we'll run into some more like that. They were faithful for a while, or they followed God, but not with their whole heart. They were right there, and they had the ability to actually become faithful and to be who they needed to be and to honor God as He deserves to be honored, and they simply chose not to. And when it comes to a lot of Christians, when I look at a lot of them, I see potential. Their potential is about as high as the sky if they'll get out of their own way long enough to live up to it. They have the potential to do great things and to let God use them to do great things. They just won't get out of their way long enough. They're in their own way. They're thinking about what it might cost them. They're worried about this. They're worried about that. Or they just want to do what they want to do in the moment, and they're wasting. All they're doing is wasting their abilities. They're wasting the talents that God has given to them and refusing to use them. And to me, that's the greatest disappointment that there is. That's the greatest disappointment that there is for a person to not live up to what God had planned for them. And some of that may be my personality. I'll readily admit that. I was more of the kid that a spanking didn't really bother me as much as if my dad looked at me and said, "I'm disappointed." But when I read the Kings, I worry about that. With myself, I worry about that. With myself first, I worry about that with Christians I know and love, and so many of them that are this close, if they will just get that thing out of their way. They have no idea what they're capable of. And a lot of them have abilities I would give my right arm to be able to have. I just don't have them, and I'm never going to have them. They just lack that. They won't make that jump for some reason. And Jehu, I think, is an example of this. He had the ability. He could listen. He could do exactly what he was told. He obviously had abilities as a warrior. He had all these different, he could have done great things, but he just wouldn't get out of his own way. And it's like, sometimes in coaching when you're with a kid, and I remember in the '80 Olympic hockey team, when the United States won the gold medal that year when they weren't supposed to, and haven't won it since. They won it with a bunch of college kids, and nobody could understand it. And Coach Brooks chose a person to play goalie for that team that nobody really expected, because they said his game was off because his mother had passed recently. He just didn't seem like himself. And nobody could understand why Coach Brooks was playing him. And finally, Brooks sat him down, and they had a confrontation in the hallway at the arena after the hockey game was over. And he finally looked at him and said, "I don't know what your problem is, and I don't know, you know you're better than you're playing, but for some reason you won't let yourself be who you know you can be." And he said, "I'm tired of watching you waste it. Either show up and be who you are or walk away." And I think about that, and I wonder if Jesus doesn't say the same thing to me, if he doesn't say the same thing to other people. Get out of your own way, show up, and do what you're capable of doing. Because the half-hearted stuff doesn't count for anything. One of the things we've learned is that partial obedience is really disobedience. The Bible lays that out very clearly, that partial obedience is disobedience. Think about it. If I tell one of the boys to go in and to feed the fish that is in the tank in their room and to clean their room, and they come back and they say, I did it, and I walk in and they have cleaned the room but they didn't feed the fish, people say, well, they did what you told them to. No, they didn't. They did part of what I told them to. They may have obeyed me on one thing, but they did not obey me in the fullest sense of the word. And the Bible is filled with images like this where a person is partially obedient and God looks at it and says, you didn't do what I told you. 1 Samuel 15 is the prime example when Saul comes out and says, I've obeyed the command of the Lord. Now, he killed the majority of people he was supposed to kill. And he thought Samuel was going to be happy because, I've done what God said. And Samuel said, if you've done what God told you to, then why do I still hear animals in the background? Because if you had done what I told you to, they'd all be dead. There wouldn't be any sound. Partial obedience is the same thing as disobedience. And so Jehu is one of those guys for me. And he forces me to think a lot about myself. Now, when we come to 32, there's this, one of these moments, we're studying the kings under the idea of the rise and the ruin of Israel. And about 1 Kings chapter 12, things start. You've kind of hit your peak with Solomon and things start coming down now. And there are moments, slowly, moment by moment, you can see them kind of descending into the pit of destruction, really. And we've seen some of those moments with Ahab's family, with the welcoming in of, with Jeroboam welcoming in calf worship, and then you've got Ahab's family bringing in Baal worship. They're just progressively speeding up and going down. But this verse in verse 32 may seem insignificant, but it also shows that God is starting to speed up the process, okay? It says, in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward to all the land of Gilead, and the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites from the Aror, that is by the valley of Arnon, that is Gilead and Bashan. And so what he cut off, you remember when they went into the promised land, you had 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh, who chose to stay on the other side of the Jordan. They want in the Transjordan area. That's where they chose. They said, we like it here. We just want to stay here. Joshua said, fine, but you have to go help your brothers conquer their land, and then when you do that, you can come back, you can have this. Okay? What God just gave to Hazael, king of Syria, was all that land. You see, it may seem like an insignificant statement, but it's very significant. Because now God is starting to chip away at the kingdom. He just took away a significant portion of the kingdom from the people of Israel. And in that portion, first of all, it hurt them financially because they lost control of major trade routes in the Transjordan area. Second of all, they lost a buffer. When you're placing your capital, you put it many times in places where it can be protected. Okay? You're concerned about the enemy's ability to close in upon your capital. One of those moments in history was during the American Civil War, when Lincoln was still trying to figure out who was going to be the best general, and he kept blowing it. And I don't know that he blew it as much as his generals did. They just wouldn't do anything. But the Confederate Army came dangerously close to Washington, D.C. And it was a high concern amongst the people who were leading the Union. Why? Because if you take the capital, then it's over with. They wanted distance between the capital and the front lines of the Confederate Army because it posed a great threat. The same thing is true here. When you take away this portion of land, in Syria, which is northeast. Normally, they would have had to go through that area and defeat armies in different cities along the way, and then cross the Jordan, and then get to Samaria. Well, now you just ripped away that hurdle. You just ripped away and made it about twice as easy for them to do what they need to do. God is slowly taking it away from them. Because of their unfaithfulness, he's taking it. And so it's Hazael, which he, by the way, anointed king over Syria in chapter 8, as we saw, chapter 8, verses 7 through 15. In verse 34, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Jehu and all that he did and all his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel?" Basically a way of saying the history books that they would have had access to. So Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, of course, the capital of the northern tribes. And Jehoahaz, his son, reigned in his place. And the time that Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. Okay. Now, Jehu is also significant to us for another reason. I think this was on the PowerPoint. Let's go here. Yeah, okay. So this is the obelisk of Shalmaneser. Okay? An obelisk is a certain design for monuments. There's a couple in Paris. The most famous one that probably we will recognize is the Washington Monument. It's an obelisk, okay? That is, it starts with a broad base and it tapers itself out with a pyramid-type top, okay? Built in honor of special events. Now, this is the obelisk of Shalmaneser, who is the king of Assyria. And the reason I bring this up is because when Hazael of Syria comes to take Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh, historically we understand why this is. Now, biblically, we understand that God is in control. He's working out affairs the way that he wants them. But this obelisk gives us an idea and other historical documents of what is going on. Furthermore, it also testifies to the fact that the Bible is not just a made-up story. You're finding historical relics that show you this person is alive at that time with that name doing this, that the Bible has said all along. Now, Shalmaneser was the king of Assyria, and Assyria was on the rise. And so what happened was Jeroboam went to Shalmaneser to strike a deal, a peace treaty. Okay? And that's why in the second bar, okay, you see, it's not the clearest. We need that new projector like now. In this second bar, and I'll give you a closer look here in just a second. It's not the easiest thing in the world to see, but this is Jehu bowing down to Shalmaneser and paying tribute, and the writing that is above and below gives that description. And so he is making an alliance with the Assyrian people, and that upsets Hazael, the king of Syria, because the biggest threat he faces is Assyria. And so it feels like he's turned his back on Hazael, and so Hazael in turn then comes and takes land away from Jehu and the people of the 10 northern tribes. But all of that was, by the writer of the Kings, an act of God. And how he works through those affairs of history, it's always hard to tell, but that's what's going on in that particular context. And you can look at that. This is the British Museum where the obelisk rests to this day. All right, any questions or anything on those? All right, chapter 11, in chapter 10 and chapter 9, when we're dealing with Jehu, we're looking at the 10 northern tribes. In chapter 11, we kind of take a break, chapters 11 and 12, and we look at the south for a little while. And some interesting things go on here. Now, chapter 11, some people might find it interesting for different reasons. You've got Athaliah, who's an interesting character. I mean, she's 8 shades of crazy. I don't really know how else to put that. So some people find it to be an entertaining story in that sense. It's a suspenseful story. But really, chapter 11 should really cause us to perk up and to pay attention very closely. Because if this chapter goes differently, you and I can't be saved. If this chapter goes differently, we can't be saved. And by the way, God would cease to be God because it mean he would have broken his word. It's very significant. Okay? So, as we're looking through this, let's keep some of those things in mind. So, in chapter 11, verse 1, now to understand what's going on, we'll have to back up just a little bit, but we'll do that here in just a minute. It says, now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. Okay, so Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah. Now, Ahaziah, you remember in chapter 9, when Jehu was anointed king, and he killed not only the king of the northern tribes, but he also killed this king, the king of the southern tribes, her son. And so what we're doing, what the writer is doing, is kind of backing up in history just a little bit, okay? When you tell the story of history, you can either tell it in blocks or you can weave it all together at once. And what's happening here is we're being told it in blocks. They'll tell you the story of Jehu, and then you got this block here, and then to tell the story of Joash, you kind of back up, and the block kind of cuts in over here and then comes out over here. And so it's just a different way of telling the story. Now, she is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, Athaliah is. She married Jehoshaphat's son, is that right? Just a second. Yes, she married Jehoshaphat's son. Okay? So, and you remember Jehoshaphat and Ahab were the ones in 1 Kings 22 that went to war together in order to try and defeat Syria on that occasion. And so here she is. She's now an older woman at this time. Her husband has been dead, and now her son dies at the hands of Jehu. And she arose and destroyed all the royal family. But Jehosheba, which we later find out, or we see right here, she is the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah. She's either Athaliah's stepdaughter or Athaliah's daughter. One or the other. It's not really clear from the text, but there is some direct relation. So even her own daughter or maybe stepdaughter ends up being the one who prevents her from doing what she wants to do. She took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from the king's sons who were being put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So, first of all, her maternal instincts aren't really present, right? Her son dies, and so her solution is, well, let's kill his kids too. I mean, I'm not saying I'm the most functional human being, but even I can tell you that's something not adding up there. What she's trying to do is protect herself. She wants to take over and protect herself. So she starts having all the sons, all the people that are in the line of succession, she starts having them killed. But she misses, which shows you how well she knows her family, she doesn't even realize she misses Joash, a baby. She doesn't realize that he doesn't die in the process, that he's missing. And his aunt is the one who has hidden him away. Now, why is it that those verses, if those verses read differently, why is it that everything we believe falls apart? It's exactly. You have the family of David. God has made a promise to David that one of his descendants will reign, that one of his descendants will come, and that he will always reign on the throne of David in Jerusalem. All of David's direct descendants just got slaughtered, except one. The entire scheme of redemption hangs on one baby boy who is hidden. If he dies, these promises don't come true, which means God cannot be trusted. The reason we trust God is because God has proven himself to keep his promises. If he doesn't keep his promises, he's not trustworthy. Everything falls apart. And so what you have right here is if we're reading this the first time, say we just sit down and we start reading at Genesis and we're not even familiar really with the story of the Bible, and we get to this point and we remember this whole David discussion in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and we come right here and she kills all of his descendants, and we've been paying attention to what we're reading, we're thinking everything is about to go sideways. Because it was. There were only a few other moments like this. You think about the book of Esther. A moment like this becomes very real, along with a few other places. Now, the second thing that I find humorous is this. It says, and he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. She hid him in the temple. Now, here's why I find that humorous. Some people, when they read that, they say, well, they hid him in the temple because Athaliah was most likely had some Gentile blood, and she knew she couldn't go into the temple. Let me tell you something. Athaliah is not concerned with the laws and the rules of the temple. Okay? I sat and read that argument when I was in my office, and I just thought, okay, to a person who obeys the law, that might work. But to a person who has no care for the law, that doesn't make any sense. You want to know why it made sense to hide him in the temple? Because it's the one place she never was going to go. It'd be like me hiding $1 million check in somebody's Bible because they ain't ever going to crack it. Hide it in the place they're never going to go. You see, her pattern of life was so devoid of God, they knew that if they just put this child around the things of God, she'd never see him. And that's when you have to step back and ask yourself something. Somebody were going to hide something from me. Would the church be a good hiding spot? Hide it from you on, we'll take a chance. We'll do it at church because you're only there for a couple hours on Sunday morning, and then the rest of the week you're nowhere to be seen. I like my odds. If you're only there for 2 hours, I like my odds of keeping him hidden because you're not going to be here any other time. Now see, that stings a little bit and that hurts a little bit differently, doesn't it? Right under his nose. So, we'll stop there and we will pick up then at Joash, and we see the humor of she's going to cry treason here in a little bit. The irony of that, she committed treason. She's the one who's committing treason. She accuses someone else, which is an old psychological problem of many times you have to watch people who always accuse people of certain things because they're the ones that are really guilty of it themselves. So it's a lot of things going on here. So anyway, we'll pick up there and then hopefully move on a little bit more.